Hello, History72B. Welcome to lecture video number 5, if you count the orientation one. It was great to see so many of you in class today, and I hope I get to see you again. You are an absolutely amazing group. I can tell that already. I don't say that lightly. This class won't be particularly theory heavy, but there are some basic theory things that will help you to get through the class, help you understand, and that I think are important clearly, or I wouldn't give them to you. So the first part of, I've called lecture 4 a little bit of theory. The first part covers the theoretical models, essentialism and social constructionism. If you were in 72A last quarter, this is a little bit, the information is the same, but the presentation is slightly different. If you were in live lecture time on the first day, then presentation will be very different, but again, the ideas are the same. And then the second part is words and phrases to avoid in this class and why. Traditional, along with tradition and so on, and progress. Yes, I am repeating that multiple times. If the theory is brand new to you, parts of this lecture may seem dense. If you have seen these terms before, I may be explaining them and asking you to think about them in a different way, unless you took my 72A last quarter, in which case this will be a good refresher. Or if you were in class today, same deal. Either way, whether it all seems very dense or whether you've heard it all before, do not worry. I give 3 examples in this lecture, 3 ways of thinking about these models, but it is to lay a foundation, not for things to necessarily seem crystal clear at once. If there is a quiz on these models, remember that you are not graded on correct answers. You are giving points for tackling the material. So far, I've made the point that words and concepts are not static. They change over time. But it's one thing to note that words and concepts change along with other aspects of society. It is another to start to relate those changes to one another, to actually explain and not just describe what was going on. We'll look at 2 basic theoretical models, essentialism and social constructionism. My experience teaching says that these can seem complicated at first, so I'm going to tell you, if you have not encountered them before, don't panic if they don't make sense right away. And if they do make sense right away, you have permission to pat yourself on the back. You will encounter this term, epistemology, in some readings and in humanities classes. Simply put, epistemology is the study of how knowledge, including what we think of as common knowledge or common sense, rather than viewing as acquired knowledge. Epistemology is the act of scrutinizing how we know what we think we know. In true Western binary Cartesian way, I'm going to use this slide that defines epistemology by showing what it is not. Ontological questions are approached more often by philosophy than history as disciplines. You do not need to know ontology, but it might help you to understand epistemology. Again, if any of this does not make sense right away, just keep going through the lecture. I'm laying groundwork here. I'm not trying to make something that may be new make sense immediately. All of these theory slides are different ways of looking at the same epistemology, the same way that we approach how we know what we think we know and how we understand and arrange that knowledge. Diving in, many people confuse social construction theory with the nurture part of the nature-nurture debate. You can tell the difference between these by what is assumed to be true and what type of questions either set is used to answer. Nature and nurture ask questions about why and how individuals develop as they do. Essentialism and social constructionism, particularly social constructionism, asks questions about how societies develop. Again, nature and nurture are approaches to understanding why each individual has the traits that they have. So, for example, in the nature approach, all individual traits are preordained by some force, biology, genes, a deity, so on. And the nature approach will answer questions like, why does this individual like pink? Why does this individual go to college? The nurture approach, individual traits are produced by culture. Parenting, education, the media, it's always your mom's fault. And it answers questions like, why does this individual like pink? Why did this individual go to college? The type of questions are the same, but the approach to answering the questions here differs. Let's look at some concrete examples. We will look at nature first. So nature, again, asks questions like, why does this individual like pink? Why did this individual go to college? And it makes assumptions like, all relevant individual traits are preordained or set by some force. Biology can provide an answer. Genetics, genomics can provide an answer. Theology can provide an answer. Categories of traits can reliably be linked together. If someone has trait A, they will always or almost always have trait B. Don't worry if this is too tiny to read. Just listen and gauge your response. I will tell you first that I have actually encountered all of these examples presented as being the results of science. And yes, I deliberately chose a question that I do not think anyone should take seriously. I did not choose going to the college question. I leave it to you to think of nature explanations for that one. I also did not use a trait that has been explained at some level by physical determination. The physiological characteristics of cystic fibrosis have been studied and linked to particular genetic sequences, which is great. That also is not the sort of thing that I'm discussing here at the moment. So the nature approach would come up with answers like, the individual likes pink because they are female, and women are genetically wired to like pink. And yes, I have seen that. Assumes color preference is genetically coded and it is linked to the quality of being female. Second example, the individual likes pink because babies are pink and women have evolved to care for them. Oh boy. Assumes women are influenced by the skin tone of their infants, assumes that all babies are pink, assumes that all women identify babies as being pink, and so on and so on. And the third example, my favorite one, the individual likes pink because prehistoric women hunted for berries. So all women were selected to recognize and like pink. Assumes so much. Color preference is biologically determined and heritable, and it is linked to whatever also heritable traits help us to identify women as women. Only women gathered berries prehistorically. All women gathered berries prehistorically. All prehistoric berries were pink. Gathering means collecting berries. Berries were more important than other foods that can be gathered, and on and on. Again, nature and nurture are approaches to understanding why each individual has the traits that they have. A nurture approach asks questions like, why does this individual like pink? Why did this individual go to college? Yes, those are the same questions we saw for nature. And nurture makes assumptions like all relevant individual traits are produced by society. Humanities and social science fields can produce an answer. Categories of traits that are assumed to be linked together only seem to be linked because society consistently forces individuals who have trait A into a situation where anyone would be more likely to develop trait B. So I'm not taking a stand on nature or nurture. These things tend to go together often and go back and forth. And I'm not taking a stand again. Cystic fibrosis has an essentialist explanation list. That's not the kind of thing I'm talking about here. A nurture approach would come up with answers like, the individual likes pink because they are female, and pink items are disproportionately marketed for female children, clothing, toys, so on. The individual likes pink because they are constantly told as they grow up that they must like pink because they are female. The individual may come to hate pink, but pink can never be a neutral color for them. Liking or not liking pink will be interpreted in terms of the person's sex gender. Assumptions common to both the nature and nurture models with respect to the example given. They assume that women on average like pink more than men do. That's supported by a few studies, but a few studies. These approaches also assume that all women will respond to a survey on color preference the same way as early 21st century English-speaking white women. So that what evidence there is comes from that study. More assumptions common to both the nature and the nurture models with respect to the example given. They both assume assigned sex and color preference have been or are associated in all societies through all of human history, even if the specific colors vary. They also assume that sex and color preference are defined in the same way everywhere throughout human history. In other words, women are women no matter which human societies are under consideration, and they experience the same social expectations in all. More assumptions common to both the nature and nurture models with respect to the example given. They assume that sex is an important category for organizing societies for all peoples at all times. They assume that it is inevitable that sex is an important category for constructing societies, and that sex will be an important category for constructing society throughout the future of humanity. Nature and nurture assume that whatever that is the way it has always been. That is the only way it could have been. That is the only way it can be now. That is the way it will be in the future. In the example, that is the assumption that sex is a critical category of social organization and must necessarily be related to power and value differentials. Nature and nurture assume that we can ask questions like, what makes male individuals and female individuals different? Why are men more intelligent than women? Are men more intelligent than women? Why are men better at math? Are men better at math? Why do women drop out of the workforce more often than men? Why should women stay home with children? Why should women have children? Why should men be able to support a family financially? Is having a cis male parent in a family an essential part of raising a male child so that the child will not turn into an axe murderer sexually obsessed with his mom? Nature and nurture are both concerned with explaining differences between individuals. For us here, nature and nurture are applied to questions that basically ask, what causes the difference between men and women? Meaning that both approaches assume that there are differences between men and women that must necessarily matter to human society. Both methods seek to understand how sexual traits develop in individuals and what function, good or bad, these differences between men and women serve. Both nature and nurture are theoretical approaches used to decide which differences between men and women are important. The root starting place of both nature and nurture is that the roles, behaviors, differences, similarities, and so on of individuals in a society are inevitably related to sex. We can add another division of sex. The big picture remains the same. Nature and nurture both tend to ask questions like, what caused this individual to be intersex? Did things go wrong? Is this individual a danger? Social constructionism considers why sex is a form of human variation that is incredibly important in structuring human society. Not what makes individuals a certain sex and not another, not how individuals of each sex behave, but how the existence of variation in a category we call sex is related to the structure of society. Essentialism assumes that it is inevitable that society is sorted by sexual variation. Essentialism tries to determine what it is about men maleness and women femaleness that makes those categories so important or essential in the formation of human society. Essentialism relies on the results of studies on individuals using both nature and nurture approaches to support any particular explanation. Nature and nurture are basic methodologies for essentialist theories. Social constructionism starts with questions like, why is American society in a particular point in time based on one way of dividing up human variation into a category called sex, or categories within something called sex? Why is American society in a particular point in time obsessed with variation in genitals, or reproductive potential, or hormones, or any and all things used to define sex as a category at the relevant point in time? How does the construction of the category of sex as a meaningful type of human variation affect power structures in American society in a particular point in time? How does the constructed category of sex interact with other constructed categories in American society in a particular point in time? Essentialism versus social constructionism on this. Essentialism takes the importance of a particular category as universal. The assumption is that a given way of dividing people up by any variable trait is meaningful across time and space. Social constructionism posits that the very categories that essentialists take for granted are only meaningful in a particular historical context. Which one is important to the conclusions that you draw and the questions that you ask? To start off, we'll look at the way extremely simplified versions of essentialism and social constructionism approach the topic of sexuality. In order to do this, we have to define that term, sexuality, which means that we also have to define other terms, all of which reflect underlying assumptions that arise from our historically specific place and time. Many scientists in the mid-20th century who studied sexuality took an essentialist approach. We could see the assumptions underlying their model and how this affected the questions that they asked and how they went about answering them. Again, we'll be studying this period more later in class, so look at the overall point here. Don't fixate on the details. So, a mid-20th century American essentialist might consider that the categories homosexual and heterosexual can be used to reliably divide up all human beings. This means they would assume that an analog to the word homosexual, containing the same set of corollary meanings in vogue in the US around 1950, would exist in every other culture around the globe in all times. This essentialist accepts that there are or were other words in different languages, but assumes that they could simply be substituted in for the word homosexual and would have precisely the same meaning and be understood in society in precisely the same way that the essentialist uses the term homosexual in their own time and place. Most social constructionists would acknowledge that there is variability between people in sexual object choice, but would say that the categories homosexual and heterosexual are only one way of sorting that variability. A social constructionist would caution that you must consider the entirety of a society to understand whether sexual object choice actually is a major factor in organizing society. If it is, which particular aspect of sexual object choice becomes definitive? For example, genitals, age, citizenship status, how this process of defining sexuality is woven into systems of power. Note that sexuality is not the only category that can be socially constructed. Race, gender, sex, and age can also be examined as social constructions. The social constructionist is not saying there is no variability in humans. Clearly, we can recognize our friends and family because we are not all identical. And clearly, our bodies age in the sense that they change over the course of our lives. The issue is whether any aspect of that variability becomes central to defining power structures in the society. For example, determining who can do certain work, receive a particular type of education, or live in certain places. The social constructionist is also not saying that the categories once defined by a society are not real or not important, only that their reality and their importance are specific to the time and place in which they are constructed. If we go back to the Oxford English Dictionary, or OED's history of the English word sexuality, remember that word has been used to sort people by sexual object choice only since the late 19th century. The words homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, and pansexuality came into being and gained importance successively after that point, and incidentally, in that order: homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality. We will see in this class that once the concept homosexual was constructed in a particular way, scientists in Europe and the US took an essentialist stance and started to look for the root cause of homosexuality. They assumed that homosexuality was associated with a discrete, predictable set of traits centered on sexual object choice. Despite the attempt to pin down and categorize people clearly by their sexuality, the set of traits and precise meaning of homosexual would change considerably over the course of the 20th century. For example, does a homosexual only desire someone of the same sex? Is a person who chooses same-sex partners at one stage of life and opposite-sex partners at another stage of life a quote-unquote true homosexual? As the concept package tied to the word shifted, so too would the various essentialist explanations. These were based in fields like psychology, medicine, endocrinology, neuroanatomy, and genetics that themselves took shape in specific historical contexts. Social constructionists point out that the supposedly natural and invariant set of traits associated with and the assumptions made about the division of the category of sex labeled homosexual have changed over the course of the late 19th through the early 20th century. Social constructionists ask why sexual object choice became an issue of prime importance in English-speaking regions in the late 19th century, and how the category homosexual functioned in Western society after that time. One last important point about social construction as a theoretical framework to understand societies past and present. We've noted that sexuality is only one category that is given particular meanings in American society. Remember that categories such as race are also socially constructed. Categories of power are generally constructed together. In this class, we will look at the ways that race, gender, and sexuality have been constructed in interlocking ways in U.S. history. Because these categories are so entrenched in U.S. society, it can be difficult to step away from them. I often find it useful to think about a broad taste, like actually tasting food analogy here. This analogy becomes a bit goofy, but stay with me. That sense that the analogy is silly is part of the point. Welcome to the high-stakes world of Brussels sprouts. Although Brussels sprouts are quite popular now, or at least they seem to be, in the second half of the 20th century, most American children turned up their noses at Brussels sprouts. Researchers did some digging and found that Brussels sprouts, like many other members of the Brassica genus, cabbage, broccoli, kale, turnips, so on, contain phenylthiourea, or PTC for short. Some people are highly sensitive to PTC and dislike it intensely. Some people cannot taste it at all and are unaffected by its presence. In the mid-20th century, scientists hypothesized that people who could taste PTC would hate Brussels sprouts, and non-tasters would be fine with Brussels sprouts. Through the late 20th century, scientists mapped out PTC tasting as a binary on-off Mendelian trait. More recent work has linked PTC tasting to a family of genes and identified the products of one gene in particular that codes for product associated with PTC tasting. From the mid-20th century, PTC tasting or not tasting was used by population geneticists and anthropologists to study human prehistory. An essentialist approach to Brussels sprout liking is to look for either a cultural, nurture, or genetic, nature, basis. Either way, the essentialist approach is starting from the assumption that liking or not liking Brussels sprouts matters, and that they need to explain the variability in Brussels sprout preference. If A, culture, genes, whatever, then B, tasting, not tasting, then this is the next step, then C, liking, not liking, then D, one group is better than another. I didn't put that on the slide. Reality tends to be more complicated, like the third model, the C here. So if we look at A, B, and C again, an essentialist way of looking at Brussels sprouts liking, or essentialist ways of looking at Brussels sprouts liking, it could be cultural. If a society relies on Brussels sprouts, then people learn to like Brussels sprouts from a young age. Then culture is responsible for liking or not liking Brussels sprouts. Perfectly plausible. Or you could have a genetic explanation. For example, if a population has a high proportion of tasters, then they will never start eating Brussels sprouts except when starving. And then genes are responsible for liking, not liking Brussels sprouts. And third, there can be complex and mixed models trying to take into account environmental, cultural, and genetic explanations. I personally would prefer to go my entire life without eating an insect intentionally. I'm quite certain that I've eaten them unintentionally. I know that I eat them in veg periodically, often without noticing. I know that people eat and enjoy insects, and not as an I double triple dare you to eat it kind of thing, but as food, because physiologically, many insects are fine food for humans. I could make up a story about how my ancestors were exposed to a high percentage of poisonous insects, but let's face it, I really do not want to eat insects because of a combination of cultural ideas and personal experiences. My distaste for insects is shared by many people with similar cultural upbringings, but not all. Some people raised in 20th century America are totally fine with insects as food. And it turns out that PTC tasting in brassicas is not a simple yes, no. Plus, some PTC tasters like Brussels sprouts, and there are some non-tasters who do not like Brussels sprouts. These days, models are usually far more complicated than those of the late 20th century and try to account for environmental, cultural, and genetic explanations. Regardless of the complexity or basis of the model, however, the essentialist starts with the idea here that liking Brussels sprouts or not is a type of human variation worth studying in depth in order to understand the root causes of Brussels sprout affinity. What the essentialist does not do is ask why we care whether anyone likes or does not like Brussels sprouts to begin with. The starting point assumes that we care. In this case, there's not a whole lot writing on whether or not we like Brussels sprouts. So while the topic may come up in rather restricted scholarly discussions or at dinner tables, it is a matter of curiosity more than anything else. But what if we were to decide to sort society by the foods that people ate? Maybe we'd also assign status, permitted activities, and so on based on food preferences. That would be a social construction, as would the categories of food, eating, tasting that were defined and used to configure and explain and sort the world. Now, Brussels sprout preference would become critically important rather than being a matter of curiosity. A social constructionist approach would ask how the state of affairs came about, would ask questions concerning why one group is given more power than another. What a social constructionist approach would not do is say, well, the world has always been sorted by Brussels sprout preference, and that's just how it is. Let's look at two models for societies organized by Brussels sprout affinity or liking. In the first one, Brussels sprout lovers, or at least eaters, have higher status. In the second, Brussels sprout haters, or at least avoiders, have higher status. These are your Brussels sprout lovers, these are your Brussels sprout haters with the X, and these are people who are ambivalent or neutral. In the first society, let's say that more people in power early on were Brussels sprout lovers, and they chose to make loving or hating Brussels sprouts an important category. Only people who loved eating Brussels sprouts could hold high office because clearly these people could make better use of their environment and so were superior. People who loved Brussels sprouts would have an advantage. People who were on the fence about Brussels sprouts would learn to love them, or at least to eat them. And some people who hated Brussels sprouts would eat them and hide their repulsion. Conversely, let's say that most people in power at a certain point are full tasters and hate Brussels sprouts. Then clearly they would be superior because they have more sensitive palates. It proves their sophistication. Non-Brussels sprout eaters would have access to higher status. People on the fence about Brussels sprouts would find that they hated them. But then high status jobs, education, and living spaces, they might implement genetic testing for PTC tasters so you couldn't pretend to hate Brussels sprouts. And in this society, at least some people who liked Brussels sprouts would profess to hate them in order to get by and hope that no one would test them by sneaking a sample of their DNA or putting PTC in their food and seeing if they noticed. Note that a society in which food and taste determined social position and roles would not change the tongue or the fact that people come in an infinite physical and personal variety in their relationship to specific foods. But it would change the options available and the specific choices that people made in negotiating their individual experience of themselves and their world. Some tastes would be malleable. Some would not be, to varying degrees in different individuals, but this would all become extremely relevant rather than merely curious. Part 3 of this lecture is shorter than 1 and 2. You are almost done. Part 3 is words and phrases to avoid in this class and why. Part 3 builds on the concepts that I've already laid out in parts 1 and 2. This is what makes the presentation in this lecture a little bit different to the ones in the last lectures. This section is on words and phrases to avoid in this class and why you avoid them. And yes, I am saying that again. I feel strongly about this, as you can tell by the use of bold, large words and italics all in one thing. Do not use the word traditional or any of its parts of speech, tradition, traditionally, and so on, in writing for this class. The word traditional is banned because traditional is too often used to hand wave over the precise kinds of assumptions that we want to unpack. Context matters. If you are inclined to use traditional, consider exactly for whom something has been a tradition and specifically for how long. An example relevant to this class is the so-called nuclear family, the idealized husband, father, wife, mother, 2.5 children nuclear family, preferably occupying their own freestanding house, dates to the Cold War period in the US. This does not mean that marriage did not exist or that people did not reproduce before that time. What it does mean is that families were constructed and understood for both social and pragmatic reasons differently in other times and places. Do not read the nuclear family ideal back onto, say, a Puritan household. Do not read it back onto enslaved households. Doing so will prevent you from actually understanding the groups that you might be looking at. Another example is the private or domestic sphere. This idea really took hold in the 19th century, the 1800s, and only for certain groups. If you do not own a house with lots of space and lots of stuff, the idea of a domestic sphere is nonsensical. Beyond this, a woman confined to the domestic sphere, even in the 19th century, was more ideal than reality for most people. You might ask yourself already how that disjunction between ideal and reality functioned in systems of power and social control. Most emphatically, do not read women exclusively stayed home and just took care of children back onto Puritan families, over into tenement families. Again, this does not mean that labor was not divided up differentially between people based on some combination of concepts of sex, age, class, etc. But that the whole point is to look closely at specifically how and why these divisions were made, not to assume that you already know based on a mythologized version of the past. Beware of seeing progress as inevitable or having a consistent meaning across time and space. The idea that things get progressively better has a specific set of histories in the US. Always question for whom something represents progress, why, and who becomes excluded, intentionally or not, in the process. Finally, never use the phrases something has always been a certain way or throughout history something has been true in this class. For example, throughout history, homosexuals have been discriminated against, assumes that all societies throughout time and space sort sexual object choice by the same parameters and according to the same hierarchical system. These phrases obscure change over time and space. Examining and understanding how and why change occurs at particular points in history is the entire point of the discipline of history. To assume that something has always been true keeps the systems of power that operate through specific societies less visible. So, to wrap up, let's look at the key points from lecture. Key points for lecture 2. Language and the concepts it represents are not static. Changes in language reflect and affect changes in ideas. We could get some clues to this process by mapping the history of words as well as concepts. Context matters. Words and concepts must be understood in their own context of shifting language and society in place and time. Now, admittedly, this is easier to point out as necessary than it is to actually achieve. This language concept shift is a constantly ongoing process. We do not live in an age in which language or concepts are final. And the corollary to that, people in other places and times are and were neither idiots nor paragons. In English, we often repurpose old words rather than creating entirely new words. Some patterns to think about and to question why in English. The meaning of the word body acquired a conceptually specific form in the 13th century. Why? The word science has undergone some important shifts, as has the word gender. Why, when, and where? The words sex, gender, and sexuality have undergone significant changes, many of which are interconnected. Essentialism and social constructionism are methodological approaches to understanding the formation of society and power structures. Essentialism takes the importance of a particular category as universal. The assumption is that a given way of dividing people up by any variable trait is meaningful across time and space. Social constructionism posits that the very categories that essentialists take for granted are only meaningful in a particular historical context. Beware of certain words or phrases that are packed with assumptions and that obscure historical change. Studying historical change is, after all, the bedrock of the field of history. Avoid these words and phrases in my class. Traditional and all variations, tradition, traditionally, the assumption of progress and the word progress, the phrases something has always been, or some things have always been a certain way. And throughout history, never use the phrase throughout history. It causes people grading history essays to break out in hives. Be merciful. The coda today is a reminder when it comes to progress. Always step back and take a look at the big picture.